welcome to Under One Tent, a program of the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by Congregation Beth Emek, Congregation B'nai Shalom, Congregation B'nai Tikva, and Diablo Valley Hadassah. Coming up, we have several very interesting programs. Rachel Steer on February 8th, the author of Betty Friedman, Magnificent Disruptor, and especially on February 4th at 7:30 p.m., there is a concert, Biachad, Together We Build, a benefit concert for the people of Southern Israel. And I highly recommend you get your tickets because they're going quickly. The film festival, sponsored by the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival, begins on Saturday, February 24th. So I hope you'll attend that, and it continues for 6 days. Our speaker today is Herb Keinon. He's a senior contributing editor at the Jerusalem Post. He has been at the paper for 35 years, 20 of those as its diplomatic correspondent. During his time, he has covered the major stories that have shaped the nation for more than 3 decades. Originally from Denver, Herb has a BA in political science from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and an MA in journalism from the University of Illinois. We will have a Q&A session following his talk, so if you have questions, you can write them in the chat, and Peter Shapiro and Julia Bobka-Kurzrock will do their best to ask the questions of Herb. Herb, thank you very much for waking up very early in Israel and for sharing your knowledge of what has been happening in Israel with our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Just make sure that I'm not muted. Okay, you can hear me okay? Yep, okay. Thank you. Good evening there. Good morning from Israel. Look, what I want to discuss this morning is, the title I've given it, Israel's in Crisis, a war that will alter the country for generations. This war now, today, we're in the 112th day of this war. And because of its length and all the pain and suffering involved, some people, I think even well-intentioned people, are starting to lose the thread a little bit. Most Israelis have not. And what's the thread? Simply put, Israel is fighting because its people were murdered, raped, and mutilated on October 7th. Israel is fighting because to get back those hostages taken by a maniacal terrorist regime that ruled the Palestinian state of Gaza. Israel's fighting to ensure that Hamas does not have the capability or the wherewithal to ever do this again. Israel's fighting to send a message to others who may seek to emulate Hamas that it's not in their interest to do so. I know the images are difficult. I know there are many questions about the Palestinian civilian casualties in the war, but this is why Israel is fighting, and it's among the most just, no-choice wars, Ein Breira wars that Israel's ever fought. What happened on October 7th was a game changer. It was unfathomable. It's an event whose impact and influence will be felt in this country for generations and will shape the country for generations. It will fundamentally change Israel, I think, for decades. The sheer magnitude of the event is mind-boggling. And here's some perspective. In 1903, there was a famous pogrom made famous by the Hebrew poet Bialik, who wrote about it. This was the Kishinev pogrom, right? That pogrom changed the course of modern Jewish history. It helped further spur the great Jewish emigration from Tsarist Russia, and it planted the seeds for Jewish defense groups in Palestine. In that pogrom, 49 Jews were killed. Right? In 1929, there were the riots in Hebron, an event that still reverberates to this day. You go to Hebron, you talk to the Jews living there, and they still talk about it as it happened not that long ago. In that pogrom, which shaped Israel, 133 Jews were killed. 776 Israelis were killed in total in the 6-day war. On October 7th, 1,200 people were killed in the span of 16 hours. That's a mind-boggling scale. And if all those events that I just mentioned, right, changed Jewish history and Israeli history, or had a lasting impact on Jewish and Israeli history, Kishinev, Hebron, the Six-Day War, and they came nowhere near the carnage that we saw on October 7th, then how much more so will this event change Israeli history? Why will it change everything? First, because everybody feels it, right? There's so much pain and sorrow in this country right now, so many people suffering, it's almost unbearable. Were it not for the stories of heroism and bravery and courage and altruism and of a people finally coming apart to a large degree, it would be unbearable. The emotional weight that everyone is carrying in this country right now is extraordinary. Those who feel it the most, obviously, are those most directly affected, the friends and family members of the murdered and kidnapped from October 7th, and the bereaved relatives of the fallen soldiers since then. But the whole country is deeply, deeply affected by it, and it's a two-fisted punch. One punch is the pain, sorrow, mourning, and sense of grief that everyone feels nationally. It's a soul-crushing type of heaviness. The country's moved with the tales of the battles, the stories of the heroism, the interviews with the family members, the names of the fallen, the clips from the eulogies, and the melancholy music, right? It feels much like it does here on Yom HaZikaron, on Remembrance Day for the fallen that comes in May, only many times worse, right? For those who've been here for Remembrance Day, you know that it's a very somber feeling, but it's only for 24 hours. And it ends with a celebratory celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut, of Independence Day. What we're experiencing now is a Yom HaZikaron. It's a Remembrance Day that just knows no end, that just keeps on going, right? In about a half an hour now, at 6 o'clock, people are going to wake up in the country, and the first thing they're going to do is look at the radio to see, God forbid, if the IDF is reporting that there were soldiers fallen last night. It's a gruesome routine that everybody's got into. Wednesday, for instance, was a horrible day. As the country woke up to the news of 21 soldiers having been killed the day before, 24 soldiers having been killed the day before. Everyone feels that. The pain is excruciating. You turn on the news that night and you see clips of one funeral after the other funeral, and it has a lasting impact. And the other punch is the personal punch, right? The personal worry and anxiety that so many are experiencing. Because on top of the national grief and concern and frustration, there's the wrenching concern for one's own kin who are perhaps either already in the Army and regular service or were called up in the reserves in Miloim. I'll give you my own personal experience, right? During Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, I had one son in the Army for about 3 weeks, inside Gaza for about 3 weeks. Recently, I had 3 sons and a son-in-law inside Gaza for about a month and a half. It's a worry and an anxiety taken up to a new level. You can't breathe. Last night, a friend came knocking on my door at 9 o'clock at night, and my heart dropped into my feet, right? Because that's what happens. If somebody's going to come and the IDF is going to tell you that something, God forbid, happened to one of your kids. And obviously, this isn't a worry and concern that I'm just feeling, right? My kids have spouses, they have children, right? Everybody feels it. Thank God, 2 of my sons last week got out of the reserves, right? They released them. Another son and a son-in-law who are right now inside of Khan Yunis. They're supposed to get out next week, please God. But this is a trauma that I feel personally, right? And which tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people are feeling, and it shapes you. It shapes what you think. It shapes how you think the country should wage the war. It has a lasting impact, and it will impact the country for a long time going forward. How will it change things, right? First of all, the first thing that's going to change in this country, I believe, is the security philosophy, right? What's called in Israel the conceptia, the security concept, the security doctrine. For decades, Israel has lived with the idea that it can live with a genocidal organization right on its borders, right? Either in Gaza with Hamas or the Lebanese border with Hezbollah, within spitting distance literally spitting distance or rock throwing distance from its communities, from its population centers, and that it can feel protected by a super technological fence and a sense that the other side would not dare to do anything crazy or dramatic. It was a philosophy based on the idea of passive defense, of containment through deterrence and technological superiority, or reacting when you were hit, right? But not preemptive, not active defense, so as not to trigger a wider conflagration. Israel sanctified for the last couple of decades quiet, right? We were living good here. We sanctified quiet, and we were comfortable with the situation in Gaza where there was a round of fighting and then quiet and a round of fighting and then quiet, right? But that idea that you can live like that turned out to be an illusion. You cannot allow, and this is one of the things that the country has learned, you cannot allow a massive, massive buildup on your border by a organization that wants to destroy you, either in Gaza or in Lebanon, and think that everything's going to turn out okay, everything will be fine. The collapse of this security doctrine, of this part of the security doctrine, will be felt, I think, across the board. Now, we all thought that Hamas would never dare attempt what amounted to an invasion, knowing that if it did, we would pummel it, which is exactly what we're doing right now. We looked at them as we look at ourselves, thinking who would invite that level of destruction upon themselves, right? But that way of thinking was a mistake. That type of mutual deterrence does not work with an enemy propelled by religious fanaticism, right? We cannot predict this reaction, their reactions. You can't gauge them. They're going on a whole different value system. Hamas wanted to provoke this type of reaction, hoping that it would trigger an all-out war in the Middle East, right? In Yudav Shimron, in the West Bank, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Iran, with the Houthis in Yemen. They hoped this would be the match that would ignite the region, right? They hoped that this would scuttle all the talk of Israel's integration into the region. They hoped that this would scuttle any discussion of normalization with the Saudis. Right? It's kind of similar to the way Al-Qaeda thought in 9/11, right? Al-Qaeda didn't know how the U.S. would react in 9/11. Of course they did. Certainly they knew. But that's what they wanted. They wanted to ignite a war between Islam and the West. Now, what does it all mean for us? It means that we have to rethink our conception of deterrence. We have to realize that we can't rest on the assumption that the other side won't do something crazy because of fear of our reaction, because they may not care about that reaction, right? This is something that is going to have to be transferred to our thinking across the board, including our thinking about how we deal with Iran. Can we really say that Iran won't dare to attack us with a nuclear device, knowing that we would respond in kind, that they wouldn't do anything so crazy? Can we say that anymore? Can we make that assumption anymore? No, they might do something that crazy. Look at their ideological cousin, Hamas. They did the same thing. Iran's fingerprints, to a large extent, are all over this thing, right? The training, the funding, the technology, the sophistication. The scale that we saw on October 7th is not something that a terrorist organization could carry out without the help of the state. Now, Iran might not have wanted the timing and known about the timing, but the planning and the preparation for this is Iran, right? This will necessitate a change of thinking for Israel and hopefully the West also towards Iran. A few years back, Naftali Bennett, before he was prime minister, even when he was the education minister, he came out with what he called the octopus doctrine, right? What did the octopus doctrine say? It said Iran is like an octopus with tentacles, proxies it uses to sting us. And we always fight the proxies, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, but we don't ever go after the head of the octopus sitting safely in Tehran. And I think this is something also that's going to change as a result of October 7th. It's already changing. Right? A few hours ago, there were reports that Israel hit a key installation on the Iraqi-Syrian border, killing 3 Iranian militiamen. In the past, we would have been reluctant to take any action that would have had the possibility of killing Iranians because of the concern about an escalation. Now we're less concerned. What you're starting to see is a more aggressive policy towards Iran, taking the battle somehow to Iran and making Iran start to pay for the mischief in the region, right? And this is something relatively new right now. But let me go back to the conception that you can live with a genocidal organization looking literally into your communities. October 7th has shown us that we cannot. Israel's evacuated now some 200,000 people from the border communities around Gaza and from the border communities on the Lebanese border, right? Obviously, that's an untenable situation. Talking about refugees in their own country, but people are not going to move back to those communities unless they feel safe, right? And they're not going to feel safe with Hamas or Hezbollah staring down at them. It's not going to happen. Who's going to want to move into Metula right now or back to Kiryat Shmona? Israel, however, does not have the luxury or the space to leave large swaths of the country empty because people are afraid to live there. And that's why there will be no ceasefire in Gaza with Hamas in control. It's an existential question. If Hamas remains in control of Gaza, no one in their right mind is going to move back to those border communities there, right? The same thing is true on the northern border. Either Hezbollah is pushed away from the border and new defensive measures are set up along the border, or no one's going to go back to live there. One of the changes engendered by October 7th is a realization that you can no longer kick problems down the road because that gives you some quiet, but you must deal with the problem now before it becomes even bigger, right? We didn't do it in Gaza. We didn't do it in Lebanon, and now we're paying the price. I think the one exception that we did do it, right, was in Syria, where for the last decade, Israel has been taking proactive actions and prevented Iran from kind of setting up a mini base inside Syria like it did in southern Lebanon from where to attack Israel. Israel did take proactive action there. And I think going forward, you're going to see more of the offensive actions we saw in Syria take place elsewhere as well. Another change you're going to see as far as the security situation is how the country views the army and the army's role in the country. We thought wrongly, as it turns out, that we can rely on a smart, high-tech army. We can't. We need more than that. High-tech bells and whistles are great, but at the end of the day, you need boots on the ground, right? You need people on the ground defending the borders. When people move back to the Gaza border communities and when they move back to the north, there will need to be a much greater IDF physical presence there to give them a sense of security. We need more soldiers, right? And this is a change in how we view security. There was talk beforehand about shrinking the army, about a professional army, a small professional army. Forget it. Now there's going to be talk about growing it, both growing the army and growing the budget for the army. And this is going to lead to changes, I think structural changes inside the country. I believe, first of all, you're going to see this with the ultra-Orthodox, with the Haredim, right? The idea that 13% of the country now could be exempt from army service when the army needs more people, not fewer people, is an idea whose time has passed, right? And I think you're going to see changes. What you've begun to see to a certain degree is the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredim. The sparks of this understanding are starting to seep in there as well. But it's an existential question, right? We need a bigger army if we're going to survive. October 7th is fundamentally going to change Gaza, obviously. Everybody understands that what was is not what will be. This is not like the previous rounds we have where you go in, you do your business, then you walk out and let them inside do whatever they want and say, hey, I'm okay, I'm safe behind a fence. The idea that you leave a territory, like we did in Lebanon too, you throw them the keys, say good riddance, build a fence and hope they don't bother you, that part of the security doctrine has also collapsed. So the question is, what will be in Gaza the day after? Now, this has turned into a loaded political question in Israel, and one that Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want to address right now. Well, you ask yourself, why not? Because if he says he is open to inviting back into Gaza the Palestinian Authority to control it, right? This will infuriate the right wing of his government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the right-wing politicians, who might bring down his government. So he doesn't want to deal with it, right? The same as if he rules out the idea of moving settlements back into Gaza. He doesn't want to say that because he's afraid if he says it, he'll lose the right flank of his coalition. So what's he saying right now? He's saying, I'll deal with the day after when the day after comes. Well, what's the problem with that? First, the day after, it's not clear cut. It's not like it rains one day, the next day is dry. In some areas in Gaza, northern Gaza, we're already in the day after, right? With Hamas effectively neutralized, but no one is in place to replace them. And this creates a vacuum, which is not good because vacuums are filled by people, most of them who don't necessarily have benevolent designs. We have to decide what we want to see there. That being said, there are certain changes that we're already seeing inside Gaza. First of all, I think the borders of Gaza will change. Israel is already in the process of carving out a buffer zone of between 1 to 2 kilometers so that there's no structures from which Hamas terrorists can fire directly onto the communities just a kilometer away. Also, Israel has said, and it's going to retain the ability, even after the fighting stops, even after there's somebody in there to control it, to go back in whenever they see a security threat. We see this in the West Bank. If there's a security threat, although the West Bank is under Palestinian Authority control, if there's a threat, the IDF goes in. That's brought down terror there to a great degree, right? The same modus operandi I think you're going to have in Gaza as well. What are the options? What are the options that we have for Gaza the day after? Well, none of the options are great, quite frankly, right? First option is Israel stays. It's not a great option. Israel doesn't want to control 2 million Palestinians there, right? But it will have to stay at least until someone is found who can control it and prevent Hamas from taking it over yet again. Second option is an idea of an international consortium. Right? This idea has been floated, get some of the moderate Islamic states, the Abraham Accord countries, some peacekeeping force to take control of the Strip until a leadership arises inside Gaza who can take it over. The chances of that right now, I think, are pretty slim. Folks are not exactly chomping at the bit to take control of Gaza, and the price they might ask Israel to pay for it, the establishment of a Palestinian state, is something that right now Israel's not in the mood to do. Another option is the PA goes back in, the Palestinian Authority goes back in. Also, not a great option. Mahmoud Abbas riding in on the back of the Israeli tanks. The problem with that is the Palestinian Authority is weak. It's unpopular. They can't control much of the area outside of Ramallah and Judea and Samaria, let alone Gaza. There's also, I think, a certain romanticization in the West of the PA as this kind of peace-loving entity. It isn't. It isn't. The PA educates its children to hatred of Israel, right? PA allowed Hamas to sprout up in Jenin and Tulkarem, triggering waves of terror there that we're dealing with right now during this war as well. This happens to be the U.S.'s preferred option. Netanyahu has said that it's a non-starter. PA is corrupt. It pays terrorists to kill Jews. Again, it educates the hatred. And he's right. He's right. But what he needs to do, I think, is to present some kind of vision as to what he does want, not only what he doesn't want, right? He said Israel will retain overall security control like the West Bank, but he should also now talk about how he views the administration afterward of Gaza as well. This is important to retain U.S. support, something that I'll get back to in a second. How this is going to change the political map. This will fundamentally change Israel's political map in the same way that the Yom Kippur War in 1973 fundamentally changed Israeli politics for the 60 years following, or the 50 years following. The Yom Kippur War ended labor's dominance of Israeli politics. And this war is going to end, I believe, Likud's dominance of Israeli politics, and they've been dominant in Israeli politics since 77. 1973 led to the Yom Kippur War in 73, led to Menachem Begin winning the elections in 1977. And 2023 here, I believe, is going to lead to something else as well. I don't see how Netanyahu, a political magician up until now, survives this, right? You have to understand, Israelis are seething with anger and frustration right now. How did this happen? Right? Who is responsible? And they're going to hold whoever is responsible accountable. Now, it's interesting because right now everyone is saying that this is not the time to apportion blame. And they're right? This isn't the time to start a war of the Jews. This is the time to beat Hamas. But there will be a time to apportion blame. And when it comes, I believe there's going to be a political volcano that's going to sweep many of those we know today who are in power, both in government, in the Knesset, and in the military. It's going to sweep them away. Right? Netanyahu has been very slow to take any responsibility for this, but this catastrophe rests at his feet. Why has he not taken any responsibility when others have? Saying only to a certain extent that, yes, I will answer questions afterward like everybody else. Why is he being reticent to take responsibility? Because if he takes responsibility and then the next elections come around and he wants to run, he's going to suffer the consequences of admitting responsibility. So he doesn't do it. But whether he admits responsibility or not, to a certain degree, is an academic question. He's been prime minister for 13 of the last 14 years. He owns Israel's policy towards Gaza and Hamas. It's his. The idea that you can contain them, that you can have some money go in from the Qatarim and keep them happy, that you can build a $1 billion fence and protect yourself, that's his, right? And it failed. Now, are there others who are responsible for this as well? Certainly. But he can't push this off on the security establishment because, like I said, for 13 of the last 14 years, he's been the head of the security establishment. This is forever going to taint his legacy. Mr. Security, right, under whose watch more Jews were killed in one day than any day since the Holocaust. Even Netanyahu, I feel, cannot politically survive this. The polls are showing that, by the way, that were elections held today, Benny Gantz of the National Unity Party would clobber Netanyahu, getting between 38 to 40 seats to Likud 16. The Likud, by the way, is also seeing these polls and may trigger a move to replace Netanyahu, though I wouldn't put my bets on that. But the polls also have to be taken with a grain of salt, but they reflect the sentiment. And the sentiment is that those in power failed miserably and will pay for it in the next election. Every party in the coalition right now is getting clobbered except for the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties. Now, there's one important caveat to keep in mind when looking at the polls that has Benny Gantz soaring to, again, from 12 seats to 38 to 40 seats. That the polls are polling the existing parties, but that too is something that's about to change. You are going to see new faces, many people we've never heard of before. New heroes are minted in war, right? Wars create heroes, people who show staggering courage in battle, who make unfathomable sacrifice for others, for their comrades in arms, who display uncommon grace in the face of unimaginable loss. The country right now is thirsting for new leaders, those not tainted by the failures that led to October 7th, nor those responsible for creating the divisions in this country that also helped facilitate what happened on October 7th. Right? It's not clear when there's going to be new elections or what will trigger those new elections, but sooner or later it's going to happen. And when it does, you're going to see a major sweep here. Right? Many people think that everyone has to go. Netanyahu, the defense minister, Gallant, the heads of the army, the Shin Bet, the military intelligence. That's the mood. October 7th also, and I think this is important to realize, it created a rupture of faith here. Right? Israel for many years has not had much faith in the government, in the Knesset, lately in the Supreme Court as well, but it did always have great faith in the military and in the intelligence communities. October 7th comes and it dents that big time, right? To restore the faith in those in the military and in intelligence, those in charge must take responsibility and move on, because how can the country trust those in the future who are responsible for what happened on October 7th? To a large degree, restoration in the faith in the army will be a consequence of the outcome of the war, just as it was in 73. Remember, in 73, we were clobbered in the beginning. We came back and we were, within 100 kilometers of Damascus and Cairo. The same thing is happening here as well. The top echelon of the army failed miserably, leading to October, or allowing October 7th to happen. But since then, the army has turned it around. Right, the performance of the soldiers is inspiring and very effective and very successful. Their bravery, their courage, their will to fight. The army has proven itself very well on the battlefield, and I think this will go a long way into restoring the faith in the army, which quite frankly is very, very important for Israel. Another change that we're going to see, I think, is how many of us here in Israel view the relationship with the United States. many people, myself included, were the belief that over the years Israel was become a strong, serious country, and that we didn't need the U.S. to the extent that we did in the past, that we could manage on our own if push came to shove. Although we can, right, the U.S. support has turned out to be critical, extremely important. We're seeing this now in real time. Forget the moral support and the diplomatic cover, which is key, that Biden gave us from day one. I'm talking about the aircraft strike forces that were sent that has helped Lebanon or helped deter Hezbollah in Lebanon from opening up another major front, and also the Iranians, deterred the Iranians. I'm talking about what we're seeing in the Red Sea, where the U.S. and the British are taking action against the Houthis. We're talking about an airlift of ammunition, right? This is a long war. It's one of the longest we've ever fought. We need supplies, right? And the U.S. is giving it to us, and that's extremely important. I mean, I always think about the '73 war, right? When we wanted supplies from the U.S. and it was tough to get them, we had to go through Portugal, the Azeres. Here, there is an airlift of supplies, which has been essential for us. Up until now, I think most people in Israel realize that Biden's support has been astounding, right? Exceeding anyone's expectations. It's beginning to fade a bit, right? There's beginning to be more questions as the war continues. That's something to be expected. Biden is a political animal. His policies towards us are alienating a part of the Democratic Party. There's certain things he has to say, stay aligned. Israel needs to stay aligned with the international law when it wages war, the whole idea of a two-state solution. He has to say those things to play to his base. Also, I think he perceives that Netanyahu is also in a political mode. And he is, right? Netanyahu is also thinking about the day after politically. His public and adamant refusal to allow the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza or to even consider a two-state solution, there's a political reasoning behind this, right? It has political ramifications. Netanyahu is giving himself an issue for the next election. Okay, I might have messed up big with October 7th, but I am the only prime minister who can stand up and say no to a Palestinian state, right? There's a political undertone to all of this. And I think, Biden recognizes that Netanyahu is using this for political reasons. So he's starting to get political as well. Another way, though, that Biden has been exceedingly helpful to us is giving us time to wage this war, right? This is slow going, right? It takes time to dismantle an underground fortress, and that's what we're doing. Little perspective. Today's, like I said, the 112th day of the war. The Yom Kippur War was over in 19 days, right? The Second Lebanon War took 34 days. Six-Day War took 6 days. The Sinai campaign in 1956 took 100 hours, right? We're not used to this. We're not used to a war this long, or having the time from the international community to wage the war this long. And to a large degree, that's thankful to Biden. Despite pressure from his own party, the president withstood calls for a ceasefire, knowing that this only benefits Hamas. But obviously, the time isn't limited, which is something that the IDF definitely needs to take into consideration. And the last thing, and with this I'll conclude, the last thing that October 7th has changed a great deal is our sense of peoplehood, right? Unity. The one silver lining, the only silver lining in all of this, is that we have rediscovered our sense of peoplehood. We've rediscovered that there are bonds there are mystic strands of peoplehood that are binding us together, both in Israel, I think, and in the diaspora as well, right? We've come together here in a way not seen for decades. Just think back to a minute to August and September and the deep divides in Israeli society when we were at each other's throats, oftentimes quite literally, over the judicial reform, over a machitza being set up in a public square in Tel Aviv on Yom Kippur, of reservists threatening not to show up for duty. All that melted away in an instant, as if it never existed. Now, one can say, isn't that a tragedy, right? That it takes something like this to bring us together? And of course it's a tragedy, but at least we come together at times like this, right? And that's not necessarily something that we can take for granted. We've come together in amazing ways. Talking about 150% mobilization of soldiers into the reserves, incredible volunteerism, mirrored stories of how people are helping each other, providing food, even the Haredim lining up to go into the army. It's been truly amazing. We're seeing the spirit of Israel after 5 years of only seeing horrible divisions because of the unending election cycle. The bad news is that the politicians and the government have not necessarily risen to the occasion, taking too long to provide solutions. The government was slow-footed going forward, and the people stepped in. Also, you had petty politics getting in the way. The good news is that the people have stepped up. They've proven better than their leaders, something that gives at least a bit of optimism going forward. Some nations believe they've been blessed with great leaders. Other nations have leaders who've been blessed with great nations. I think we fall very much into the later category. This war has proven that. And like I said, that's what gives me optimism going forward. Let me end there and take any questions you might have.
Wow. I'm going to have Peter ask you a few questions that did come from the audience, but you covered all mine. Herb, thank you so much. So informative. And I do appreciate also the fact that you started out this talk this evening with kind of giving us the perspective of life there. That's very meaningful for us here. Peter's going to ask you one of the first questions we got earlier tonight.
Okay, I'll start with the first question, which is, I understand that Israel needs to stop the Hamas murderers, but aren't Israel's actions that traumatize the civilians in Gaza creating new generations of Hamas?
Look, I mean, that's a legitimate question. But you can look at it from the other way as well. And that is, we didn't do this, right? We haven't done anything like this in Gaza ever before. And you had a generation that was raised up whose main goal in life is to destroy Israel. So I'm not sure, that had you just said, okay, October 7th happened, but it's a tough break. We'll do something small and then we'll let it come back. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to rid the population there of their hatred from Israel. Does this add to the hatred? Obviously, but it's there, right? I mean, we felt it now for decades. It's there. You have this radical strain of Islamic fanaticism that doesn't feel that Israel has a right to be in this neighborhood, and it's going to be there whether we hand out flowers or whether we defend ourselves with tanks. Unfortunately, I'm not saying that with any pleasure, right? But I think that's the unfortunate reality. I think that what needs to be done, the people talk about the day after, there needs to be a re-education going on in Gaza, in the West Bank, in much of the Arab world, right? Just a re-education of how they look at Israel, how they look at Jews, and that's a long process, and it's a generational process. I think it's a bit oversimplistic to say, well, if Israel just hadn't done this, then they wouldn't hate them. Folks, they hate us. That's a reality that we have to recognize and we have to deal with. And you want to change it, let's change it, but the change has to happen within their society with basic re-education.
Thank you. Great answer. Are you hopeful at all, just a follow-up to that there are some protests against Hamas happening over the last couple of days?
Look, I'd like to be hopeful, right? We're talking about, a few dozen people, children and women who are protesting. I think one of the disillusion, something that gives me a degree of disillusionment right here, is that up until now we haven't seen any actions from the Palestinian civilians against this, right? They haven't taken to the streets. We haven't seen, there was a case of a hostage who ran away, right, looking for a place to hide. We haven't seen the righteous Gentiles among the Gazans, and that's very that's very upsetting. Yes, I think it's great that they have these protests. I understand that it takes a lot of courage, but it's going to take a lot of courage. But there has to be more than just a few dozen women and children out there for a movement to arise. If the Gazan population, right, stood up and said, "You're not speaking in our name. This is not the way we do things. This is bad for us," then maybe Hamas would listen. But you're not seeing it. You haven't seen it. What we saw over the last couple of days, maybe that's a good place to start. But I think we have to be realistic as well.
Okay, Peter has another question for you. Thank you.
Okay, hang on one second here, okay. I hope Herb will talk about how Israelis prioritize the desire to bring the hostages home and the demands of some to even stop fighting, if that's what it takes, if that's what it will take, versus destroying Hamas capabilities in Gaza.
Right. Yeah, look, I mean, this is the devil's dilemma, right? This is the devil's dilemma. What do you prioritize? What comes first? The hostage thing it's heartbreaking, right? It's mind numbing. And again, I mean, everybody, you look at the faces, everybody sees their own friends and relatives. Everybody can imagine this happening to them. So I think there's a great outpouring of empathy and sympathy for the hostage families, and a realization that yes, they have the duty, the obligation to scream and fight and shout to the government to do everything possible to save their families. So I think I think the Israeli society recognize that. On the other hand, I think there's also a realization that if you just stop fighting and let Hamas come back in, that what happened October 7th is going to happen again, and that this will invite more hostage taking because people will see that it works, right? So they're trying to, you're trying to circle the square here, and it's tough. Now, the government's position, this has been the government's position, also the military's position, is that the only thing that will bring about a willingness by Hamas to give up the hostages or to release the hostages is military pressure, right? The argument is that if it wasn't for the military pressure in the first 3 weeks, we wouldn't have had that first round of hostage releases. And the only way Yahya Sinwar, Hamas, he's not going to release the hostages out of the goodness of his heart. He's only going to release the hostages if he feels that the noose is around his throat, right? So that the goals don't necessarily have to be contradictory, right? On the other hand, the hostage families, and their perspective is completely understandable, is they don't have time. They don't have time. Just, stop, release everybody they want, and let them go. There's no guarantee, however, that even if you do that, even if you stop, right, that they will release all the hostages, because it's Sinwar's only card, right? It's the only leverage he has, and I think he's going to be very reticent to give it up. But again, there are no easy answers to this. There are no easy solutions to this. Nobody has an answer, and it's an extremely painful thing going forward. I think what we're seeing too is. If you remember back in the 1980s, there was an airman called Ron Arad. Ron Arad was shot down over Lebanon, and his body was taken, or he was taken captive. And the government at the time told the family to keep things quiet, because the only way that you're going to be able to bring about his release is if we do things behind closed doors. It didn't work, and he disappeared. And I think that's traumatized the country too. They don't want to see this situation happen again. So that's why you see this, you see all the protests and the demonstrations that the families of the hostages are doing, because they want to ensure that this thing doesn't come off the agenda. The country doesn't forget about them, and these people disappear like Ron Arad did.
All right, next question. Can you articulate Israel's strategy for ending the war? And is it viable?
Look, I mean, the goal of the war, as presented from the very beginning, there were multiple goals, three main goals. Number one was dismantling Hamas. Now, what does it mean to dismantle Hamas, right? Obviously, everybody realizes here that you cannot dismantle an ideology, but you can dismantle the capabilities of Hamas so that they cannot carry out their ideology, and that's what's being done. And it's a Sisyphean effort, because they've built up quite a quite an underground fortress there, and you've got to go house by house, tunnel by tunnel. It takes time. It incurs losses, but that's what's being done right now. So that's number one goal, to dismantle their infrastructure, that they cannot, even if they want to, they don't have the capability to do what they did on October 7th. The second thing is to dismantle the capability to govern Hamas. I'm sorry, to govern Gaza, right? I mean, they were the government of Gaza. Gaza, it's interesting. There was a guy here, a former national security advisor named Giora Island. He said something interesting. He said that from the very beginning, Israel made a mistake. And what was Israel's mistake? Israel's mistake was framing this as a war with Hamas rather than a war with the Palestinian state of Gaza, right? Hamas has ruled Gaza pretty much as a state. Israel now has to dismantle its ability to do that again. This is going to be more problematic because when you do that, you have to have something else to fill the vacuum. Like I said, something else to fill up the space. And we haven't figured out who's going to do that or how that's going to happen. But that's one of the goals. And I think that's also an achievable goal, by the way, right? You can push them out from being able to govern. You just have to find somebody else who's going to be willing to take over the administrative tasks, at least for the short term. The other goal is the hostage release, right? I mean, is that attainable? I don't know, right? I mean, we're not seeing great results. Well, they took 240 hostages, 110 were released, one was rescued. The proof is in the pudding here, and right now things are, that result is not necessarily great. Another goal, less stated, but I think a major goal, is to just show the region that you can't do this, right? That Israel will not tolerate this type of thing, and that if something like this is done, Israel will take drastic and dramatic action, right? It's to deter your other enemies. That's also part of what's going on, and why Israel is, he wants the world, wants the region to see what's happening. Because if Israel doesn't unequivocally defeat Hamas in Gaza, right? And Hamas is a relatively, smaller one of our enemies. Then everybody around us is also going to learn the lesson of that, and they will act on that. So I think that's also another goal of this war, and I also think that's a goal that's relatively attainable.
Can the speaker address the Iranians being Shiite and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other countries Sunnis? They hate each other. Can Saudi Arabia and Israel become an Arab-Israel coalition and defeat the Iranian hold on Hamas, Hezbollah, and Syria?
Look, I mean, that's a great question. Not only is the Saudis Sunni and the Iranians are Shia, but Hamas is Sunni and Iranian is Shia, right? And Hamas is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is Sunni and Hamas is Shia. And Iran is supporting them. Why are they supporting them? Because the hatred for Israel here apparently overrides the hatred for each other, which is very real, by the way. I mean, there's deep theological reasons that they hate each other, and they've hated each other for generations. Can the Israel and the Saudis get together and make some new regional alliance? Look, I think that was one of the reasons that the Iranians or Hamas launched this whole thing in the beginning, right? Because remember what we were talking about back in July and August? It was about some Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. It was about President Biden came up with this plan to link India to Europe through the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and Israel, right? I mean, they were talking about integration, exactly that. And that is the biggest threat to the Iranians. They don't want to see that, right? So Hamas launches a war, and that seems to push that plan, down the road quite a while. And I think for the short term, it does push the plan down the road, but I don't think it pushes it down forever, right? Because the interests remain the same. And what are those interests? There are interests between Israel and the Saudis and the Gulf countries for the region. They have common interests. They are all afraid of Iranian hegemony in the region, right? And that interest remains the same. So I think that, after this war and after the dust settles a bit, I think you're going to see the Saudis again show willingness to do some kind of agreement with Israel. We've seen it over the last couple of weeks, by the way. They're talking about a willingness after the war to do it if Israel agrees to certain terms, including a Palestinian state. I mean, that's stuff that will be talked about afterwards. But I mean, the question was a good question. Yes, there is great enmity between the Shia and the Sunni. Hatred for Israel has overcome that enmity. And the concern by the Iranians that we were coming together at some point in time, I think, was one of the reasons that the Hamas wanted to spark this war, trying to end that, right, to end any integration once and for all.
The next question is, why won't Egypt allow Palestinians to relocate to Egypt or reestablish in the Sinai?
Look, that's a good question. I think that the Egyptians are also afraid, right? I mean, the Sisi is very afraid of the Islamic Brotherhood, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, right? His predecessor Morsi was a Muslim Brotherhood guy. They're petrified of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're worried that if you allow in an influx of folks from Gaza under the influence of Hamas, and Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood Gaza branch, right? That this will cause security problems for Egypt. So I think that's the main security reason why they're concerned about it.
Okay. You spoke, hang on a second, I just lost it. You spoke early on about how Israel needs to take proactive actions because of what Hamas and Hezbollah are. How do we get this message out to the rest of the world? What can we do to make the rest of the world understand this?
My assumption is, what can we do? Meaning Israel supporters abroad. That's the gist of the question.
Yes.
Look, it's what can we do to get them to understand this? That's a good question. I'm not sure that there's going to be a lot we can do to get them to understand this. I think they'll understand it when they see that Israel is doing it, and Israel will explain why it's doing it. I think most reasonable people right now will understand that Israel, after going through what it went through, cannot tolerate a situation where Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles, right, launched or aimed in its direction from just across the border. That something has to be done, because no country in the world would tolerate that type of situation. How do you convince people of this? You put it in terms that they can understand. What would the U.S. do if Mexico invaded Texas, right? Or if Mexico had along its borders ballistic missiles aimed for Washington? We're in the same type of situation, and we can't be seen, or we can't be expected to allow something that other nations around the world would not be allowed to grow up along the borders as well.
Next question. How does Saudi Arabia feel about the conflict, and for that matter, all those Arab nations that are trying to develop a relationship with Israel?
But that's interesting, because again, we have the Abraham Accords. You had, the Accords with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, right? You've had some kind of moves towards the Saudis. And what's been interesting is we're now, like I said, the 112th day into this war, and the pictures are brutal, right? And those countries haven't broken off their ties. They haven't broken off their ties. They haven't returned their ambassadors. Turkey did, but Turkey's, that's the Muslim Brotherhood Turkish branch. But those countries have not. And I think that says a lot. That says where their interests are. They are as concerned about Iranian designs in the region as we are. Look, I think there's a big difference between what the governments think and what the people think. Right. I think if you would ask the ministers in Bahrain and in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, right, about the war, they would tell you, well, we hope Israel destroys Hamas, because Hamas is a danger to them as well. This type of the fanatical Islam is a danger to their regime as well. So I think they're on one side of the fence. I think to a large extent the populations on the other side of the fence because of the deep sentiments they have for the Palestinians, and also because because of the pictures that they're seeing hour after hour coming from Gaza. So I think you've got what the governments want and are thinking, and what the people want and are thinking. The governments have to take into consideration what the people want. But again, I think one of the most telling things here is that those relations between us and those Arab countries have not broken.
Thank
Next
you.
next question. We read in Haraz tonight, there is a proposed ceasefire worked out by Qatar and the hostages will be released. Are you aware of this?
Look, I would take all the reports of all kinds of proposals with a grain of salt. We see this all the time, the proposal for this, but I believe the proposal that the question was asking about has Israel stopping the war, withdrawing from Gaza completely. That's something that just won't fly with the country right now. These are all negotiating positions, right? The trial balloons, seeing what will be accepted, what won't be accepted. Apparently what they show is that there are talks going on right now behind the scenes. But what the terms of the agreement will be, take what you read on that with a grain of salt, because nobody really knows. But the fact that there are talks going on, I think also to a certain extent proves the point that it's only military pressure that gets Hamas to talk, right? Because up until not too long ago, they said we're not even going to talk until the fighting stops.
All right, here's the question. I would like to hear Herb speak to what can American friends of Israel, the Jewish community, and allies do to support Israel in its darkest hour?
That's a great question. And I think the most important thing that American Jews can do is just is make their voices heard, right? Make their voices heard. I think something that was very important was that the huge rally you saw in Washington with 300,000 people there. I think that was exceptionally important. I'll tell you why it was important. It sends a message. It sends a message to the American public, because what we're seeing on the television, right? I mean, you see all the anti-Israel, all the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian protests taking place in cities around the country. The guy sitting in his house in Topeka, Kansas, might be watching that on the television screen and say, "Hey, well, that's what people think," right? And I think it's very important that there's a counter to that. There's a contra to that, and that contra is seen in the public square. The contra is seen very publicly. I mean, if ever there was a time for American Jews to come out publicly, right, and voice their support of Israel, it's right now, right? Why? Because again, you have to make it shown to the American public that there is support for Israel, that the anti-Israel protest that they see, that doesn't reflect, right, the American position. It's also important, I think, for the general public in America also to see that certain Jewish organizations like the Jewish Voice for Peace, or if not now, when, right? These are outlier organizations in the Jewish community that just get so much press, right? Amplified. Their voices are amplified because it's a boy bites dog story, right? You don't generally see Jews coming out against the state of Israel. So when you do, that becomes big news. I think it's important for the mainstream American Jewish community to make their voice heard, so that the rest of the general population realizes that these people do not speak for the Jewish community. It's also important. Look, I mean, politics is important. The support we're getting from America is important. And it's important that the representatives who support us, and thank God there's still quite a lot of them, right? They see that American Jewry supports them in their support of Israel. So I think this is a critical time for American Jews to stand up and have their voice heard.
Okay, we have two more questions.
Thank
How will Israel know, or what will Israel look like when it has defeated Hamas?
How will we know? That's a good question. Look, again, you're not going to defeat an ideology. That's not going to happen. But you can degrade their capabilities. We're going to start to know when the number of rockets decrease substantially, which they have. We're going to know when you see that there's nobody in control, where there's nobody distributing humanitarian aid because Hamas isn't doing it anymore. You're going to know from intelligence information you get from the ground. You're going to know when you see more and more Hamas fighters lay down their arms. I think that will all be signals. It's not going to be. It's not a situation like with Japan where they're going to surrender on a ship out in the Mediterranean Sea, right? But when quiet comes back to the region, or to the area around the Gaza communities, when there are no more rockets and when the number of Hamas terrorists firing RPGs inside Gaza reduces, you'll know that pretty much the time has come. Again, it's not one day it's wet, the next day it's dry. There's going to be stuff going on in Gaza now for years, right? I mean, you're going to have terrorists who are going to fire stuff off once in a while for years. But to do it in an organized fashion with a organized control and command system is different. Also, Israel, like I said, Israel is slowly dismantling the tunnels, and it'll know, according to intelligence, right, when that has been done to a sufficient extent to say, okay, we've pretty much taken care of it.
Thank you.
All right. Here's a tough question. What will it take for Israel and us to go to war against Iran?
Look, I can speak for Israel. I can't speak for Israel, but I think I have a pretty good understanding. Look, Israel's always said that if Iran gets the capabilities to put together a bomb and the ability to send that bomb, it'll act, right? It'll act before it has the ability before it has both those capabilities, right? It'll act to prevent them from doing that. And I think that this war in Gaza only shows how serious that threat has to be taken, right? Because like I said in the beginning, I think there were some people who thought, well, we can end up living with an Iranian nuclear capability or capacity because they wouldn't be crazy enough to do it because they know what we would do. That way of thinking doesn't hold anymore, right? You can't count on their using that type of reasoning. So Israel will have to take action if it believes that they're reaching that point. They've been trying to reach that point now since the mid-1980s. They haven't reached that point for various different reasons, including what Israel and other countries have been doing covertly to keep them from doing it. I would hope that this war will energize the world community to realize that this is just something that the world cannot tolerate, because you can't predict what they will do, and we have to only think here the worst could actually happen, because again they're thinking in terms that are different from the way that we generally think about situations like this.
I'm going to slip in one more question. Okay. Recently, there was a survey by a group in Qatar that suggests that a significant majority of Arabs in every surrounding country, including those we have peace with, think that what Hamas did on October 7th was acceptable. Please comment on this.
Right, and that's the disheartening reality, right, that we live in. I think it's something that they have to recognize and just look straight in the face, right? That's the reality. I mean, there was a question, earlier. Is it just seeding or sowing the seeds of more violence and hatred against Israel? The ground is fertile there already. We don't need this to sow the seeds. It's there. It's been there, right? And that's why in much of the Arab world, right, if you look at those polls, also shows that much of the Arab world was pleased about what happened on October 7th. There's an interesting poll taken in the West Bank showing that in the West Bank there's huge support now for Hamas, huge support. I think 85% thinking that what happened on October 7th was good. What's interesting was inside Gaza the polls were taken. I don't know how exactly the polls were being taken there, but the polls said that in Gaza the support for Hamas and support for what they did on October 7th was a lot less than it was in the West Bank. Now that's logical. Why? Because they're paying the price of it and the West Bank isn't. But again, I think what those polls show is a very disheartening reality. And that, I think many of us here, had illusions that we've been accepted, that they like us, that they want us, that they need us. Not so fast, not so easy. There has to be a generational shift in how, some of these Arab societies look at Israel. Now you're starting to see it in certain places, right? I mean, in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Morocco, they're changing the textbooks, right? The text is changing. You have to see this all over. And again, this is something that's going to take generations. It's not something that you're going to snap your finger, it's going to happen, or something necessarily that we're all going to see in our lifetimes, unfortunately. But that's the reality. Given that reality, though, I mean, we're not going anywhere, right? So just we have to learn how to deal with it, how to protect ourselves from it. And this is one lesson I think that we're getting from what happened October 7th.
Wow. Herb, you have just answered so many questions, and this speech was very informative. I personally can't thank you enough. And I thank the audience also for all their questions. We don't have any more questions for you. But wow, great talk. Thank you so much. I don't know if everyone realizes that you were up and ready to talk with us at, I don't know what time you woke up, but you were ready at like 5 a.m. over there. An early Shabbat Shalom to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just thank you so much from the bottom of our East Bay hearts in Contra Costa County.